Let's begin with the scene just moments after Anthony Rota announced his resignation as Speaker of the House.
Mr. Rota, do you have any thoughts as you leave, sir, for Canadians, for people you run?
Not for today. The important thing is that Parliament continues and democracy lives and works in Canada. That's what comes above all else.
Français aussi, peut-être?
No.
Merci bien.
Vraiment pas.
Excuse-moi.
Rota's resignation will take effect at the end of the parliamentary sitting day tomorrow. But his apology and resignation isn't enough yet for the opposition parties. They're demanding an apology from the Prime Minister himself. Okay, here to discuss this day and the fallout is Steve McKinnon. He is the Liberals' chief government whip. Mr. McKinnon, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, David.
I realize this is a significant today. It's safe to say that all of the parties agree this was a shameful moment in Canada's Parliament. I wonder why the Prime Minister is not in the House today, why he wasn't there yesterday. Why are we not hearing from the Leader of the Government on how Canada is dealing with this on the international stage?
Well, the Prime Minister, I think, spoke perhaps even several times to reporters and others on this. The Prime Minister, as you would well know, and your viewers, obviously, David, has a certain rhythm to his appearances in the House of Commons, and that is, very, very typical from week to week. But I don't think comments from the Prime Minister have gone missing. I think he's been going out very publicly, and I think he expressed himself very, very clearly on what has transpired here. I think he expressed that Canadians were embarrassed by what occurred, that Mr. Rota subsequently took responsibility for the events that occurred in the House of Commons, and as you know, today has done what we think is the right thing and accepted responsibility and resigned.
But Mr. McKinnon, hasn't this become a bigger deal than a parliamentary controversy now? If you look at the international headlines this is garnering, I've seen fresh Russian propaganda in the last hour of this incident being used to undermine this country and undermine Ukraine. I mean, we haven't heard from the Prime Minister in terms of whether he spoke to President Zelensky, whether he's going to issue a formal apology to Ukraine. I mean, aren't these things Canadians need to hear in the chamber where this all started?
As the Prime Minister has said, David, Canada is embarrassed by this. I think that's why we are in the situation where the Speaker's apology to the House did not suffice, that it rose to a different level. This is a very serious and significant oversight on the part of the Speaker. He's taken responsibility for that. He's explained that it was his responsibility and his alone, and has done that before the House, and then subsequently, as you know, today, resigned his position. No small thing, rather unprecedented, in fact. So I think that the significance of the event has been met by a very significant resignation, something we don't see around here very often, if at all. And I think it's a sad day. Anthony Rota is a good man. He's a good person. He served his constituents and Canadians with distinction. But this was a grave, grave error, and one that unfortunately parliamentarians and Parliament could not overlook.
We have an explanation from the soon-to-be former Speaker and his staff as to how this happened, that Mr. Hunka's son is a constituent of his and asked if his father could be invited, and he was invited, and the list wasn't shared with the Prime Minister's office, and the vetting, whatever vetting was done, appears to have been done by the Speaker and the House of Commons. The Conservatives aren't buying that. They want a committee to look into this. Do you think a committee should look into it?
Of course they're not buying it, because they have a political agenda, Mr. Cochrane, and as has been, I think, reported or commented on by many parliamentary observers, of course the Speaker of the House gets an allocation of seats, and of course people are going to be deferential to his invitees. That doesn't mean they slipped the basic security checks that are required, and as such, Mr. Rota's guest would not have been deemed an imminent security threat, a threat to be in the building. But no political checks, obviously, occurred prior to prior to this event, and Mr. Rota has taken responsibility for that, appropriately so, and has paid a very, very significant price. And you have the events of today.
But I appreciate that the opposition has a political agenda on this. We've seen that is apparent. But do they not have a point that maybe a parliamentary committee needs to look into this and maybe make recommendations on whether vetting and screening procedures might need a review after what happened on Friday?
I think the opposition has a political agenda, David, and what that means is that they will try anything, and they've tried 3 or 4 different things on this very matter to try and embarrass the government and make this very significant incident. I don't want to understate the importance and significance of the incident, make this very significant incident into more than what it is. There's actually quite a simple explanation. It's not acceptable what has occurred, but it is quite a simple explanation. And I think Canadians who are watching us, Canadians who watch Parliament, Canadians who look to their leaders, expect that we would focus a lot more on the issues of the day, on cost of living issues, on affordability. We have a very significant bill before Parliament as we speak. I think they'd all rather that we focus on those issues rather than some narrow and mean, frankly, political agenda on the part of the Conservative Party. And I say that in adding that the New Democrats, the Bloc Québécois, don't seem interested in any way in that kind of discourse, in that kind of political gamesmanship. And I would invite the Conservatives to kind of refocus on the issues that Canadians care about. That's not to understate these events. This is important. Right. This has been an embarrassing incident for the Parliament of Canada. This should not have occurred. Responsibility has been taken by by the Speaker, the former Speaker, who I think very clearly stated what has occurred here. And I think that's a very sad day for Canadians who are embarrassed by this. It's a sad day for Anthony Rota, who's a good person and a good leader, who has been brought low by this incident. But it's time to get on with the work of Canadians. It's time to get on with what Canadians expect us to be here doing, which is making their lives better.
No, I appreciate that Canadians are concerned about affordability, but as you've pointed out, I mean, this was embarrassing, and they're also concerned about the reputation of Canada abroad. So I appreciate your point that the Conservatives have a political agenda here, but a conclusive description or report into how exactly this happened, you see no value in that if a parliamentary committee were to look at it and to see if there are gaps in vetting and screening and invitation protocols?
Well, vetting and screening, at least security screening, I think we've all established did occur in this instance. I think, again, the Speaker has an allocation of seats, a Speaker's gallery, in fact, it's called, where he invites his guests to come, and there's deference paid to that. I think you can bet that the next Speaker, whoever he or she may be, will be applying a lot of their own due diligence to who occupies those seats in the future, and that lesson will have been deeply learned on the part of the next Speaker of the House. And I don't see beyond that what further explanation is required here, David.
So we're in a situation now, just as a final point, where there is soon going to be no Speaker in the House of Commons, and MPs will have to start the process of electing someone to replace Mr. Rota. How embarrassing would it be for your government if a Conservative ends up with the speakership of the House of Commons after all of this and what's happened?
Well, there's a secret ballot of all parliamentarians and a preferential ballot. I expect several parliamentarians will come forward. We all have to signify, in fact, our lack of interest in pursuing the Speaker's job. So I'll state for you categorically, David, that I will be sending my name in as someone who does not want to put their name forward for Speaker of the House. So a lot of that has to play out over the next day or so, and I'll let those events play out, and we'll be watching them with interest, of course.
Steve McKinnon, the Government Whip, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, David.
Okay, we asked a Conservative MP to come on the show today to talk about this, but no one was made available. But Peter MacKay is a former Conservative Minister of National Defence and a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he joins us now. Peter MacKay, good to talk to you again.
Good, thank you.
I wonder, what was your reaction? You've been in the House through a lot of interesting moments. What was your reaction when Speaker Rota announced today he was resigning?
Well, not really surprised. This was not a fine moment for anyone, least of all Speaker Rota, but really for all Canadians, all parliamentarians. It was an embarrassment. It was a very low point in certainly in my lifetime to see this happen in the Parliament of Canada. There's a lot of complicated history here, to say the least, but it was avoidable. It was what is classically known as an unforced error. And having an accounting for that, as you were just talking about with the previous guest, is never a bad thing. You know, I think it's been a very, very difficult situation for the government to find itself, but it's a reminder about how very often history is painful, but we must always be honest about that history.
I wonder, you've been in Parliament, you spent a lot of time in Parliament and your whole life around politics. Do you accept the Speaker's explanation that this was his mistake and his mistake alone? Because there are political attempts to pin this on the Prime Minister's office. There's no evidence trail that leads into the PMO. Do you accept that this was purely the Speaker's office?
Well, I want to accept Anthony Rota at his word, and I think that that's the starting point. Until and if there is a time where there is evidence that there was oversight or some sort of vetting that was done by the Prime Minister's office or the Whip's office or some official, frankly, I'm surprised that that would be the case. I'm surprised that nobody would have tweaked to the fact that this gentleman was in the gallery, let alone going to be singled out for praise. You know, the words that are jarring now that seemed to be perhaps appropriate at the time were hero, a Canadian hero. Nothing could be further from the truth, as we now have come to understand. This 14th Waffen Grenadier Nazi SS unit was involved in atrocities, and this has been well documented now, and in fact, it is a bit of a black mark on Canadian immigration history that so many from that unit seem to quite easily immigrate to Canada and blend into our population in spite of the blood on their hands that is now apparent.
The Prime Minister has spoken on this a couple of times, going into Cabinet, for example, and in other sort of, you know, the hallway conversations at various meetings or whatever that happen on Parliament Hill, but he hasn't been in the House of Commons itself since this happened and wasn't there today. Does that surprise you? Is that a significant thing, his absence in Parliament right now?
Well, again, I don't want to come across as a rabid partisan. It does seem unusual that he wouldn't be there to take questions, to answer for this. While the Speaker is seen as a separate entity, almost like a judge, they are still a member of the Liberal Party, and the government, of course, has to answer for what happens in the House as well. And so it is a bit questionable that the Prime Minister wouldn't be there to take direct questions on this issue, given that, as you know, David, this has ricocheted around the entire globe and has also fed into the Russian Putin war machine in terms of their propaganda, which, again, it looks bad reputationally on our country, both how it happened and how it's been handled since.
It's been interesting to watch the strategy unfold, Mr. MacKay, in terms of how they're dealing with this in Parliament, having the House Leader answer the questions and kind of treating this as a parliamentary controversy. Do you think that's going to fly on the international stage? Do you think there needs to be a formal apology to Ukraine, as some have suggested, from the Foreign Minister, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister? We've not really heard anything definitive on that from that level of government.
No, and I'm speaking personally now, David. I do believe that a formal apology coming from the Prime Minister would be appropriate in this instance when you're basking in the light of the visit of President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was in our Parliament, and, in some ways gaining from that presence. When things go pear-shaped, as they have here, you have to take some responsibility for that as well. And so, there is clearly a lurching from, one sort of embarrassing and troubling situation to another. What we saw happening, of course, in the relationship, the deterioration of the relationship with India, over this ongoing unsolved murder and the drama around pointing the finger directly at the government of India. And now this coming right on the heels of it. This has been really one of the more disastrous periods that I have witnessed in my lifetime happening within the Parliament of Canada.
Former Conservative Cabinet Minister Peter MacKay, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to bring in some opposition members of Parliament. We were hoping to connect with NDP House Leader Peter Julian, but he got caught up in a House leadership meeting. But René Villemure is with us. He is the ethics critic for the Bloc Québécois. Mr. Villemure, thank you so much for your patience. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder, the Conservatives say a parliamentary committee needs to dig into this. There needs to be a report looking into exactly how this happened. Does the Bloc Québécois feel that is necessary, or do you accept the Speaker's explanation for how this happened?
Well, first of all, the Speaker's explanation was quite clear. I mean, he did the only thing that he had, the only one option, and he resigned. But I also think that the government is accountable for the actions of the House, and we haven't seen anything from the government side besides excuses from the House leader. So I think this is not over yet.
How is explain that accountability line, and in that, you know, the House is independent and separate and distinct from the government, you know, in the flow chart and Constitution and the way Parliament operates.
Yep.
So what is the government's accountability for what happened here in your view?
Well, you know, the funny thing is, from an ethical point of view, when we look at the newspapers titles from other countries, they don't talk about the House, they talk about Canada. So that's why the accountability goes to the Prime Minister. He's accountable from the country, for the country. So in this case, he has to say something. He's the leader of the country. So something has to be done. Nobody talks about Mr. Rota in Washington or in India. So that's why it's not a legal accountability, it's an ethical accountability.
Right, okay, I take your point there. Okay, so let's just split those two accountabilities and let's deal with what happened on Friday. The fact that this man was invited, the fact that this man was recognized and applauded and led to this humiliation, which has now led to this resignation. In terms of accountability for that happening, does the Bloc Québécois accept that this is the Speaker's and Speaker's responsibility alone, or do you believe, as the Conservatives allege, the Prime Minister's office was in the middle of this and they're also responsible for that moment?
Well, we believe it's mainly the Speaker's fault in this case. There was no vetting, no appropriate vetting done. Now, the Conservative asked for the RCMP to get into it. We won't get there. But I also think that the Prime Minister cannot be silent. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying he's accountable in the first portion we talked about, but he cannot be silent. Look, we had this problem with India last week. Our external affairs are in shambles. I mean, it's been a disaster for a long time. Basically, people laugh at us on the international stage. So something only for that reason has to be done. We just can't leave it to the speakers and say, this is an internal matter, it's over with, and let's deal with it now. Now, something has to be done. So we will insist upon excuses from the government.
So just to close the loop on the parliamentary issue, do you think a committee should study the invitation and the screening and the vetting as the Conservatives have suggested, or do you think you have the answers you need on that?
I think we have the answers we need. I don't think a committee will get much answer. I don't know which committee would handle this, but if I'm talking from the ethics committee point of view, I don't think we'll get much more into it. Right. I mean, the path is quite clear. No vetting was done, no vetting enough was done, and damage was done. Now, the Speaker resigned. Damage control in some way, but I mean, the reputation of the country will not be repaired in a committee.
Right, and you correctly, in my view, made the point that internationally, this is not about Anthony Rota, it's about Canada, the government of Canada, and the Parliament of Canada. And the Prime Minister wasn't there today. He had events in Toronto. He often isn't in Parliament when it isn't Wednesday, when he shows up and takes all the questions. So tomorrow will be quite the day. What do you need to hear from the Prime Minister in terms of what they're going to do about this and the hit Canada has taken on this internationally?
Well, first of all, I mean, we need excuses to the communities that were hurt, to President Zelensky that would put at risk.
Excuses or apologies?
Apologies, I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
no,
sorry.
I got you.
Yeah, but we need apologies to the communities that were hurt, Jewish community, Ukrainian community, to President Zelensky that would put at risk, because this is Russia's, I mean, it's field day for Russia. So he need to apologize to these groups in the name of Canada. Because right now, again, as I said, we're the laughingstock of the world.
Are we the laughingstock? You mentioned India earlier, and I know that was an explosive allegation. I mean, that was a week ago yesterday. It seems a lot longer than that, given the events of the past few days. That started out as a real shocking moment, and gradually corroboration got filled in by our allies and support came from our allies, Canada's allies, as it went on. Are you equating the two, or do you think this is the embarrassment and India is a controversy?
Well, India is a controversy, of course, but I mean, I look at the sum of all the actions over time, the non-action on China's interference, the non-action on the special reporter, all these things, eventually they add up, and the sum of these elements is not good looking for us. Now, India was badly handled from the start. It turned out to be okay at the end. I mean, not the situation, but I mean, the explanations were clearer. But I think that there's a sense of panic to the government, and they barely can handle surprises or unusual events.
We are going to move to a speaker election, or you're going to move to a speaker election at some point, because Mr. Rota's resignation is effective end of day tomorrow, end of day Wednesday. Mm-hmm. Do you know yet when the election for the new speaker will be? I know there are meetings happening late this afternoon. Do you have any clarity on that?
No, not really. The meeting's happening right now as we speak. Okay. So we'll have probably some news, but I think it'll be something like Thursday or early in the other week. It cannot last long because the chamber cannot sit, the House cannot sit without a speaker. So it has to be done quickly. Right,
and complicating factors is the vote for the speaker cannot be done virtually. It has to be done in person. Right. So on that, Mr. Rota, you'll remember this. Jeff Regan had been the speaker, and the Conservatives and some of the opposition parties didn't like Mr. Regan as speaker, and kind of there was a concerted effort to get Mr. Rota elected as speaker to sort of get Mr. Regan out of there, taking a more preferential Liberal than a less preferential Liberal. Mm-hmm. Can you see a Liberal winning this election for Speaker, or do you think we end up with Chris D'Entremont as the Speaker of the House of Commons, a Conservative Deputy Speaker?
Well, that's a good one, because we've been talking about it, just rumors, but I mean, we have to look for public interest, and I think that somebody that has public interest at heart and can master that function, which is not easy. So I think the odds are up, but I think that we cannot just go with a newcomer that is not used to the job. So there are a few people that's been acting as vice presidents up to now. I mean, I think they have a shot at it, but I wouldn't say any preference for me.
You're not ready to endorse anyone?
No.
The Bloc is not ready to sign on?
No.
All right, well, René Villemure, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for your patience and sticking around. We always appreciate the time.
Thank you.
House of Commons Speaker Anthony Rota resigned today. This follows calls from opposition parties for him to step down. I'm joined now by the first person to make that call publicly, NDP House Leader Peter Julian. Mr. Julian, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here.
I understand there have been late afternoon meetings between the various leadership of the various parties in terms of what to do next in the House. What kind of an update can you give us on what happens next in Parliament?
Well, the House leaders meet on Tuesdays traditionally, and we've got a good working relationship. I think this is very important that Canadians know that the different parties can work together to make sure that things move through smoothly in what is clearly an unprecedented week with the tragic incident last Friday that has hurt so many people. And I think the discussions now are, we have what the standing orders would indicate, but we need to make sure that we have a smooth process around elections, and that really is something that can really be achieved by having all parties agree on how things should unfold over the next few days. And those discussions are ongoing.
Well, the Speaker will be gone by end of day tomorrow. And Mr. Villemure, René Villemure from the Bloc was on earlier today, and he correctly points out Parliament can't sit without a Speaker. So does that mean we're going to have an election for a new Speaker on Thursday, or will the House adjourn and push this to next week?
That is a great question, David, and I'd have to say stay tuned. I'll tell you what our preference is for the NDP. Because this is a very important week for reconciliation. We have Truth and Reconciliation Day on Saturday. We believe it's really important that we make sure that members of Parliament are able to participate in those events. We could come back next week to have that election of the Speaker. And so that would be certainly our preference, not to rush the election, because there's a number of things that need to happen. For one thing, every member of Parliament is on the ballot unless they send a letter to the Clerk of the House saying that they don't want to be on the ballot. So right off the bat, we have 338 candidates, and those letters will have to be going out. If we go for a rapid election, that paperwork is much more complicated to do. getting people in from across the country, because you can only vote for the Speaker physically present in the House of Commons. That is another element to consider. So we're working through all of those things, but as far as the NDP is concerned, what we'd like to see is a smooth process. We believe that next Tuesday would be a good day to have that election, but it would take a consensus, I think, of all parties to put in place that process that would lead to that. And so those discussions will be ongoing through the afternoon and through the evening.
Okay, so while you're working through that, the Liberals want the Conservatives, want a parliamentary committee to work through this controversy and study how the invitation happened, the security screening, and the vetting, and what deficiencies there may or may not be. And they also believe that the Prime Minister's office bears some responsibility for what happened here, and not just Speaker Rota, who is resigning as a result. Do you agree that a committee needs to look into this, and do the New Democrats believe the Prime Minister's office is in some way responsible for this?
Well, first off, the NDP believes that we need to get to the bottom of this. We need to make sure that it doesn't ever happen again. The damage, the incredible hurt that has been caused to the Jewish community and other communities, the stain that has gone worldwide in terms of our Parliament and the House of Commons. We need to ensure this never happens again. And committees are well charged to do that. There are a number of committees that could be looking at it, and certainly we'll be talking to our colleagues to make sure the best way forward. Absolutely. Jagmeet Singh's also been very clear. He thinks the Prime Minister should apologize for what happened on Friday. That is an important next step. Yes, it was the Speaker who made that decision. Yes, it was the Speaker who brought this person connected with the Waffen SS in an unbelievable showing of bad judgment. But it is important that the Prime Minister apologize on behalf of all Canadians, certainly all parliamentarians. And the work that will be ongoing in terms of how to reconcile what's happened on Friday is something that will take us some time. I think committee work is part of that. I think the Prime Minister apologizing is another part of that. We do believe that we have a lot of work to do to bring Canadians' confidence in our Parliament back to the standards that Canadians have enjoyed in the past.
I just want to parse your answer a bit just to make sure I understand it. So you would like a parliamentary committee to look into this, not necessarily to assign political blame in the Prime Minister's office, but to shore up any loopholes and problems that may exist in the invitation and vetting process. Is that correct?
Yes, but it could be more than one committee. I mean, there's procedure and House Affairs, there's government ops, there's a number of different areas that could be the focus.
Right.
And we're agnostic. We want to work with all the parties to make sure we get to the bottom of this and we get answers.
But I think I'm correct in understanding that the New Democrats accept that this is Speaker Rota's screw up and not necessarily anyone's else. But you want the Prime Minister to apologize because this is much bigger than problems inside the Parliament because of the international implications of all of this. And on that point, Mr. Julian, I wonder what do you make of the fact that the Prime Minister hasn't addressed this in Parliament since this happened. He wasn't there Monday. He wasn't there today. I suspect if he follows his usual schedule, he'll be there on Wednesday and take all of the questions as he typically does. But what do you make of his absence today? Should he have been there?
Well, our focus, as you know, from yesterday was asking the Speaker to resign. And it is a sad day that Speaker Rota did resign, but it was absolutely the right thing for him to do. I think tomorrow the Prime Minister should be in the House and should be answering questions. There are questions that people are raising, and I expect that he will do that. Our concern now, this first phase around having the Speaker acknowledge the magnitude of the error that was committed was very important, not just to apologize as he did yesterday, but as I raised right after his apology, on behalf of the NDP, we believed it very strongly that he needed to send that strong signal by stepping down and acknowledge the that break of confidence. The fact is, it was a breach of trust. We trust him to bring people into the House of Commons that are deserving of the honor that the applause of the House of Commons bestows on them. That was clearly not the case, and a lot of harm has been done. And we've got a lot of work to do to rectify that. Okay,
so we're going through that process, and we'll find out what next steps are, but clearly Anthony Rota is gone. When the Prime Minister is there tomorrow, what would you like to hear from him in terms of a message to Ukraine, to the Jewish community, to the Polish community, and to allies in terms of how to repair some of the damage this incident has done to the country's reputation?
Very clearly, I think he needs to acknowledge that harm was done, and that as a parliament and as a government, that everything needs to be done to make sure it never happens again. And the acknowledgement as well that we need to be moving forward in a way that is really represents, enhances our parliament. And Canadians need to be proud of what happens in the parliament every day. No Canadian can be proud of what happened last Friday.